As an investor who's bought 13 properties in the last 10 years with my wife, I've made some massive mistakes. Now, I could have called this video the top 100 mistakes that I've made, but what I've tried to do is reduce everything that I've learned in the last 10 years and the major mistakes that I've made into one short, sharp video. Hopefully you can have a laugh at my expense, and hopefully you can learn from my experience and hopefully not make these mistakes for yourself moving forward. G'day there, my name's Ben Everingham and I'm the director here at Pumped on Property. Now, we're a buyer's agency who loves the Southeast Queensland market at the moment, and in this video I'm going to explore some of the major mistakes as well as some of the major lessons that I've learned. For those of you who have been following us for a while, you probably heard me talk about my first investment mistake, which was a property that I bought on the central coast of New South Wales, massive 5-bedroom home with a granny flat out the backyard, and I bought it in 2011 for literally $213,000. The mistake that I made here was trusting that my property manager was looking after the property after I hadn't seen the property for literally 5 years. And about 5 or 6 years after I bought it, I went down there to have a look at the place to see if there was any work required, and I realized that the person living in the property was subleasing to about 5 or 6 other people downstairs, and that the place was in an absolute nightmare state. Fast forward on from there, months and months and months later, I get a call from my property manager one Thursday afternoon, and she said, "Ben, I'm out the front of your property. I don't have good news for you. Your granny flat's on fire as we speak. The police are here, the fire department's here. I'll call you back." This was the first major thing that had come up for me in my investment career. Straight away, obviously, jumped into my emails, rung my insurance company and was like, "This is happening, am I fully covered?" Luckily I was, which was the huge lesson that I learned. 1, to have great insurance in place. 2, or to manage and make sure I looked after my properties better and made sure I looked after my property managers better and manage them and their expectations. But long story short, the tenants in the property had burnt down my granny flat. Then apparently the house was used to sell drugs out of or something like that, this granny flat, the police report said, and the fire report said. And so over the next 6 months that it took me to get the insurance money back and renovate the property for selling it, my house was broken into 4 or 5 times. A bunch of stolen cars were dropped at this property. The place was in an absolute state. It ended up costing me $97,000 is what I got from the insurance company, and every dollar out of that $97,000 went back into fixing up the property. So absolutely insane day for me. Imagine getting a call saying your property's burning down, then your property manager hanging up the phone, but huge lessons in there as well for me. The second mistake was a more recent property. So a few years back, just before Christmas, I was lucky enough to pick up a big piece of land that was subdividable on the beaches of Brisbane. And so over about the next 6 months after that, I went through the subdivision process and ended up selling one of the pieces of land, keeping the other one and building a brand new home on it. But the mistake that I learned here was trusting that my solicitor was doing absolutely everything that they could do. So what happened is, just before the property was due to be built on, the builder went to the site and, got the bobcat out and cleaned up the site, which is what they do just before they put the concrete slab down to start the project. Now, just luckily on the day that he was clearing the site, the person that I'd sold the other piece of land at was at the site at the same time. They came running up to him and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And he's like, "I'm not sure. I'm just the builder. I'm just obviously, cleaning up the site to build on." And they're like, "That's my site." So what my solicitor had done, which I didn't realize because I trusted that they would do everything right, is the site that I wanted to keep, that I'd told the builder to build on, the solicitor had got the lot numbers mixed up, and the site that I wanted to keep had been sold, and the site that I was obviously have now, which was the one that I thought I'd sold, was the one that I was supposed to build on. So thank whatever was looking after me on that day, that, whatever was protecting me on that day, that this person had rocked up just at the exact time the builder was starting the project. Luckily, they hadn't got a slab down or a roof on or a frame up, which would have cost me literally $100,000. And the builder's gone, "Okay, you can keep the clean site," and moved across the next day to the other site. But the big lesson here was always double check, especially when you're building brand new or doing a development project, that the solicitor has done what they said they were going to do. Now, I went back and looked at everything I absolutely wasn't in the wrong. I'd clearly marked up which lot I wanted to keep and which one I wanted to sell. But again, you know, just trusting that your team of advisors 100% has your back. What I've learned the hard way multiple times is you need to be doing your own due diligence. That was an almost big mistake that would have cost me hugely and greatly, but luckily enough got out of that one okay. Now the third mistake that I made still is probably the one that is the hardest for me to take to this date still. I've moved on from it, but every time I talk about it, I get a little bit pissed off. And so what happened is, at the time I was working for somebody else, and one of the people that I was responsible for their marketing said to me that they had this incredible, great piece of land that was super undervalued, and they were the builder, that they could build it for me for nice and cheap, and that I'd be able to flip it for $100,000. Now at that time in my life, I wasn't earning too much money, and I thought $100,000. I was like that get rich quick type of thing. My eyes lit up. I went and bought this piece of land, and then after buying it and settling on it, I just thought, I obviously better do some due diligence. And as soon as I started the due diligence process, I realized that I'd bought an absolute lemon, that I bought it for too much, that the building contract I'd signed was above market value. And I trusted, like so many other people do, that this builder would look after me, but really he was just looking after himself. What we did was we built that product, and then we had to leave it completely vacant for about 7 or 8 months while I sold it. I ended up selling it for a $40,000 or a $50,000 loss, which meant that year, my after-tax salary, I literally worked half of the year for completely free. That absolutely devastated me. It took away a lot of my confidence. But what I learned from that experience was that due diligence is absolutely everything, and that I would never buy an expensive property in a small regional marketplace again. So again, good lesson. I've moved on from that. I've never made that mistake again. And now I've got a really, really detailed process that I follow for myself and my clients, so that we don't make those mistakes moving forward either. Now, the fourth mistake that I made was a recent one. Basically, I bought a property on the Sunshine Coast, or a piece of land, and then I built a really high quality home that I was going to put on Airbnb. Now, when I looked on Airbnb, there were 300 other properties in this particular suburb, all up for rent. And then about 2 to 3 months after I completed the project, I got a letter in the mail from the council saying that effectively the use of the property for short-term rental on Airbnb was not allowed. When I questioned the council and talked to a couple of town planners, I realized that it was completely fine for me to do in that area what I wanted to do. But the problem was, I'd built the property and they only allowed it for people that had built previously before that year. Now, I'd done my town planning checks, I'd got my advice, I'd talked to the local council on the way in. Everybody had verbally told me that it was okay, and a couple of people in writing. But at the time, later down the track, I didn't ask one of the right questions, which I needed to ask was, could I build that property and then rent it out for Airbnb in that particular suburb? And if I had have asked that very specific question, I would have got a completely different answer, and I probably wouldn't have proceeded with the project. So again, another huge lesson in due diligence, to make sure that you're getting advice from multiple people. Now, when I buy a property, I get advice from a builder, a certifier, a town planner. I talk to the council about my site directly as well. I get the advice of my solicitor, my property manager, my building and pest inspector. And by collecting all of those different ideas and opinions on the site, I generally identify the red flags much, much sooner, which allows me to move forward with confidence. So again, one simple question that I missed, I was in that project for $1 million. I tried to take it to auction, but it was during the coronavirus and it was too hard to sell. So what I was able to do was come to an agreement with the council and the local town planner and figure out a solution that would work for me to hold the property long term. But again, just a lot of energy wasted, a lot of time wasted, a lot of money put into the project, and a lot of stress that I just didn't need to have. So massive lesson learned, again, the hard way, but as always, double check and make sure that you're personally responsible for your own investment as well. Now, my fifth mistake was one that I did a couple of years back. My wife and I got super excited. A cheap piece of land came up here on the Sunshine Coast. It was on the water, that was only about a K away from the beach. and we decided to go all in, build a really beautiful dream home. Thankfully, we only spent about $800,000 creating this product. It was when land prices were still super cheap up here a few years back. And then we moved into the home, absolutely loved the home. It was beautiful, but decided that because we were pregnant with our third bub, there wasn't enough yard space, and that we'll just sell the property and then move into another home, which is crazy, I know. You know, again, we were so emotional, we were so excited about it. I think we got caught up in the hype and then didn't really think about what it would be like to live there, because it was quite exposed. People could walk past the backyard along a path along the water. It was a very small piece of land. It was on the water but facing south, so it was quite cold for most of the year, even though it was a sunny coast as well. So I just sort of thought, well, we've only held it for 12 months. I'll chuck a tenant in it because it's a great property. We'll get a good rent return. And then my wife went and found another, which is the home I'm in now, which was expensive. I had a little freak out or a minor meltdown because I had an expensive property here and expensive property here. And I decided that it was time to sell that one on the water that we'd built. Now, between that year that we'd rented it out before we decided to sell it, I could have sold it for about $1,030,000 at the top of the market when everyone in the street was selling theirs at the same time. But I waited, the market changed, I got the timing wrong for the sale, and we ended up selling it for about $870,000, about $150,000, $160,000 loss, literally in a 12-month period by just not picking the right timing to sell that particular asset. Now, as you've heard me talk about in so many other videos, timing is absolutely everything. There is no Australian market or Sydney market or Perth market. There is a series of suburbs in Australia, each at completely different stages of the cycle, at completely different times of the year, you know, times over the course of a decade as well. Now, the big lesson for me was make sure if you're going to spend money on an expensive home that you think about everything. You think about, could you live there in the future? Is it going to be right for the children you have now or the kids you may have in the future? And try and think a bit bigger picture. What if you need to sell it? What could you sell it out for if you decide that it's not right for you? Where I just had these emotional goggles on. I'm like, yes, I'm finally going to be living on the water. I've absolutely made it. We overcapitalized on the home as well. Like, we went all in on it, and, you know, lesson learned. Thankfully, we were able to not just break even, but make a bit of money. But, you know, losing that $150,000 was a huge lesson in timing and intuitively following my gut. I knew it was the right time to sell as soon as we moved out, but everyone was like, no, you should keep it. It's such a nice place on the water. Why would you sell it? And, you know, lesson learned. Now, the sixth mistake that I made was, and I think it's been the one that's cost me the most, although mistakes 9 and 10 are also some bloody big ones too, was just not understanding real estate properly when I was getting started. I was so lucky enough to be finishing university at the very end of the GFC. And I was also very lucky that I found my passion for property early. So in 2011, living in Sydney, I started to buy my first and second investment properties at age 24 and 25. At that time, I wasn't earning much money. I was in IBM's global graduate program, literally earning $55,000 a year. Had a little side hustle that I was making about an extra 20 grand a year, doing some contracting to the Queensland government that I hooked up when I was at uni. And so, you know, I wasn't able to go out there and buy the best of the best or the blue chip property in Sydney, which nobody that's getting started, or most people getting started, aren't in a position to do that. Now, my strategy at the time was to buy as many cheap properties as I could, as quickly as I could. So I went out and bought a unit. I went and bought that second house on the Central Coast. And then I came up to Queensland with my wife after that grad program, and I bought like a really cheap beachside renovator. Then I went and bought another really cheap property in Brisbane. Now, at that point, because I wasn't earning a lot of money, I'd completely capped myself out for servicing and wasn't able to do anything for a long time after that. Literally 2 or 3 years it took me to buy another property. Now, while I was completely financially restrained because the banks wouldn't lend us any more money, the Sydney market went absolutely feral. Now, the big lesson that I learned here is I could have just gone out and bought one really good property in Sydney, or maybe even two. They probably would have even at that time lent me money to buy 2 properties. I could have bought 2 great quality houses with granny flat potential close to the beach in the south side or the north side of Sydney. At that time, you've got to remember things were so much cheaper. Could have bought a great place for maybe 600,000, even 550K in some of those suburbs. And I would be so much better off, literally $1 million or $2 million better off than I am now, because I thought it was whoever had the most properties and cheap ones would be as good ones wins, where in reality, the lesson that I've learned is if you can take advantage of timing and you can invest in quality, you'll be significantly better off doing a few things right than rushing around and buying a heap of junk. I'm so grateful that I bought those 4 properties at that time, because everything has gone up in value since the GFC. But if I was doing it all again and in your position now, I'd be really understanding where is the best place to buy for the next 10 years? Where is the most undervalued pockets of Australia with the great long-term history? Hint, Brisbane and Perth. What can I do to get capital growth, cash flow, and improve my position? I'd be buying higher qualities closer to the city, closer to the beach, with both capital growth and cash flow potential. And they're the sorts of properties when I'm looking to buy now that I'm loading up with. But obviously 10 years ago, I might not have been able to afford them, and I certainly didn't know what quality looked like. So we live and we learn. I'm grateful for what I've done, but there's such a better way to do it if you can learn from someone that's done it, or if you learn from these videos and obviously slowly connect the dots together to understand what the right investment for you looks like. Now, the 7th mistake is linked to, just having a look at my little sheet here, linked to the second mistake that I made. That was where the solicitor got the lot numbers wrong. And that was actually the 7th mistake that I made, was selling that second piece of land. Now, at the time, I didn't realize it, but I was struggling with a massive amount of anxiety. I had a lot of fear. I was buying into the hype because Sydney and Melbourne prices were declining by 15% in that year, that the whole property market was going to come backwards a little bit, and I didn't want to be caught building on 2 properties at one time. Even though the business was going good and I was in a safe position with a savings buffer, I just got a bit freaked out and I sold that second piece of land. Now, I did sell it at that time for a really good price point. That was over 2 years ago now. I still sold it for more than I could sell it for today. Like, the local agent, the #1 agent, got me an absolute deal on that sale. But what I realized is I can't go and recreate that product at that price now, which I was able to create that piece of land for about $330,000, and now it's worth about $420,000. So the big lesson that I learned is don't make decisions when you're feeling anxious or overwhelmed and you're not logically thinking properly. I made that decision without talking to my wife, without talking to any of my advisors or mentors. And that not just cost me a really, really good deal that I could have kept for the rest of my life and produced $40,000 a year of passive income for life once I built the home, but now I have to go out and replace what I sold with something that's more expensive, that might not be as high a quality as what I had. So for those of you that do deal with mental health stuff like I do, no matter how successful you are, no matter how good your life may look or how good it is, we all go through the ebbs and flows. And if you do go through those times when you're super high and then a bit lower, just make sure in those lower times, Russell Brand calls it benchmarking sticks, that, if you're thinking about doing something based on fear or a fear mindset, that you just sanity check what you're doing with logic and maybe check it with a couple of other people that aren't so connected to that fear that you're feeling. Because ultimately, I should not have sold that property. It was absolute winner. Luckily, I've gone and replaced it with another one recently, but it took 2 years to find another deal that made as much sense, and lesson learned. Now, the eighth mistake that I made was with the Airbnb property up here on the Sunshine Coast. You constantly hear people talking about don't overcapitalize, don't spend too much in an area that you shouldn't be spending it, don't put too much into the home, don't get too emotional. And that's completely cool in some instances. But in other instances, what I did is I was just with my blinders on last year. I'm creating this Airbnb property. I'm going to make it the perfect Airbnb property of all time. But I forgot about some of my fundamentals, which is when you've got a big piece of land, the market or the valuers based on comparable sales want to see a bigger home on it. So I built this really, really beautiful single story, smaller 3-bedroom home with a beautiful yard and pool which did get a great valuation from the bank. But if I had have turned it into a larger double-story 4-bedroom home with 2 or 3 bathrooms, a larger pool, and spent a little bit more money landscaping it, I would have got about an extra $150,000 to $200,000 valuation by literally spending an extra $50,000 to $60,000 on the way in. So I've learned the lesson about undercapitalizing there. I think sometimes it's important, if you're buying in a really cheap area, to not overdo it on your renovation, or if you're buying in a cheaper area, to not overdo it when you rebuild. I'm not talking about having the best street in a shitty, the best home in a shitty street in a shitty area. But in some places, you know, like these beautiful beaches on the east coast and west coast of Australia, in the south side of Australia, some of these suburbs closer to the city, sometimes thinking about where the market will be in 5, 10 to 20 years from now on the way in is as important as making sure you manage your cash flow and renovation or build project properly and statistically. So for me, you know, huge lesson learnt there. The floor plan's small, the bedrooms are small. You know, it was only when I went to the market to resell it that I started to get that feedback that everyone loved it. They thought it was the most beautiful property they've ever seen, but it was just too small for their family. That cost me the easy resale, which was, I'm so glad I didn't sell it because I figured out a solution with the local council. But, you know, again, just knowing that for spending 50K, I could have made 200K, I know better than that. And so whether I'm doing something for Airbnb, for long-term hold, or for a short-term flip, which are the 3 strategies that I have as an investor personally, I'll be making sure that I review the market, create the right type of product, and then make the best decision from a 360 perspective, following the fundamentals that I follow when I'm going for the other types of projects, not just looking for that cash flow. Now, number 9 and 10 are basically the same thing. There's 3 properties that I've missed out in the last 7 years that I still think about sometimes. All of them come back to me being either anxious and fearful, or egotistical and not wanting to pay too much at that time in that market, or really bad advice from my advisors. So what happened is there was a place on the Sunshine Coast, just a few houses off the beach. I could have bought it for $330,000. My bank manager told me that I couldn't buy it. That home just resold for $900,000 5 years later. There was another home just up the road from me here in a beautiful street, a huge block. It had a really shitty knockdown on it. Again, I had it under contract for $312,000 about 5 years ago. Got a bit fearful at that time. Terminated, actually it was probably 7 years ago. Terminated the property. That property just resold with a brand new home on it for $1.4 million. It would have only cost me $400K to build that home. So I would have made literally $600-700K profit. I wish I could say that was my biggest mistake. The last one was last year. I was at an auction, or the year before. It was on literally the beach on the Sunshine Coast. I let this property because there was this fucking guy sitting next to me that was like, Hobart's the place to invest. The Sunshine Coast is too expensive. You don't want to pay more than $650,000 for this place. It was on the water, on the beach, like walking distance onto the sand. He's like, you don't want to pay more than $650. This market's very bubbly at the moment. So I let it go. The guy bought it for $651K. You know, it was him and I left in the auction. He was stoked. Those properties are now selling for $2.4 million after people have knocked them over and built a brand new home on them. Again, like just getting caught up in other people's stuff. As an investor, the biggest thing that I've learned is you need your own plan. You need your own strategy. You're only as strong as your team of advisors. And once you understand the data, the market, and you're educated, make decisions based on data. You know, don't be like me and sit down next to some dickhead at an auction who thinks he knows something about the market, and that guy ends up costing you $1 million over 2 years because you followed his advice rather than following the information. I knew that that place at that price was an absolute steal. Now that said, I am grateful that we missed it, because if I didn't miss that property, I wouldn't have had the confidence to buy the one we're in now. But that property would have made me $1 million, and this one's made me about 100K. So, you know, all things considered, I don't think I'd be sleeping poorly at night with that outcome. There's some of the lessons I've learned. There's some of the mistakes I've made. If you've made some big mistakes, put them in the comment section below. For those of you who are seriously thinking about buying an investment in the next year or two, or the next 3 to 6 months, jump over to our website and book in a free strategy session where myself, or my brother Simon will sit down with you. We'll talk about exactly where you are, exactly where you want to be, and we'll educate you on the current market. And then from there, you can take that information and go and buy something amazing on your own, or maybe you can become one of the small number of clients that we choose each month to work with us. But either way, I wish you all the best. As always, stay safe and learn to invest with confidence.